Very nice to be here. It's my first time here. When Brian asked me if I would come, he actually wanted me to speak about in praise of populism. I said that's not my thing. I do know something about language, so we negotiated in praise of populist language. Okay, there are a number of slides here, and I've done that because you can have them basically afterwards. So by all means, get them from Brian. There are some tips in there, some theories, some models you might want to use in your speech writing, etc., as well. So just look upon it as a kind of a tool that you can use afterwards. Just a strict definition of populism, a political philosophy, a movement that represents or is claimed to represent the interests of ordinary people, especially against the establishment. The only decent study I know, deep studies done by Professor Susan Hunston. She's a professor of linguistics at the University of Birmingham. She's retired now, I believe. She did a study of the language of Donald J. Trump in his first presidential term. She did a corpus study. I'll show some more details of that in a second. She basically concluded that that there's a lot of kind of casual conversational overtones in the language of President Trump, certainly in his first term. And although that style was quite odd at the time for a political leader, it seems very, very familiar to his audience. And she went on to conclude the following, and that's that final sentence: "It is the true language of populism." Let's have a look at some of those other aspects of that study. She saw, for example, that when he was describing things like a flood, he described it as the flood was very devastating. So the word very comes up an awful lot. Words like utterly and absolutely, words you might expect a politician to use, weren't used that often, if at all. Very is incredibly prominent, as is the word beautiful to describe any kind of object, really. This is the prominent word, so very few wonderfuls, admirables, no joyfuls, and maybe one or two marvelouses. But beautiful is a standard word that he uses. And with regard to his delivery as well, he wouldn't say, "We are going to do that." He'd say, "We're going to do that." So actually altering the register, as it were, to appeal. We also saw in Hunston's study that, and it was a corpus study, so what she'd done, she started in the late 90s, she looked at the speeches of Clinton, of Bush Jr., of Obama, and compared these with Bush's. And she concluded that he's moved away from how politicians speak to align with what's known as the common man, whatever that means. But she did see that compared to those other three presidents, he was using shorter words, had a more restricted vocabulary, used simpler grammar, shorter sentences, and apparently had fewer nouns compared to verbs. I'm not quite sure what that means. She doesn't dwell on that, but that's an interesting phenomenon too. So quite a bit of focus on President Trump. But of course, I don't need to this is just how it was reacted to at the time. A very prominent writer, Charles Blow, at the New York Times, the headline of his article back in 2017, he said that Trump savagely mauls the English language. And you'll have seen this kind of headline quite a bit. And that is kind of the attitude, should we say, often, of the establishment, that this is a mauling of the English language. This is not worthy of a politician. This is dumbing down, shall we say. Now, also an interesting quote from Joseph Borrell, the foreign minister of the EU. This was at the end of his first term in power. He said that Europe must learn quickly to speak the language of power. And in that article, he talked about communicating in a more effective, more simpler way. This article is from 2020, And although I haven't done a study of speeches since that time, just my general observations tell me that not much work has been done in this area in the past 5 years, to put it bluntly. It's still rather technical, rather polysyllabic and abstract and dense. Let's take you right the way back. Of course, the idea of populist language and populism is nothing new. Any of you who perhaps did the classics would know about the Gracchi brothers at the end of the last period of the Republic, no, the beginning of the last period of the Republic, sorry, Tiberius and Gaius, who were aristocrats who implemented lots of reforms, agricultural reforms, social economic reforms, basically taking away land from the aristocrats who owned it, are saying there's a limit on how much you can own and giving the rest to the poor. Now, this didn't go down well with the Senate or the consuls, and of course they had them killed. Caesar too was known for taking land off the senators and redistributing that to his veterans once they'd served 20 years in the army. A really interesting example, I think, is Cicero, because Cicero he's basically in defense of the Roman Republic against populist leaders, but using populist language. In many of these cases, and the case against Verres and the case against Catiline, these were, especially Catiline, he's somebody with aspirations to take over. If you've read the four speeches, you'll see how Cicero prosecutes Catiline in the Forum. And I don't know if some of you read a bit of Latin, but if you get the Lube, you can see the Latin and the English on 2 pages. Very simplistic style, very much addressed to the audience. Lots of humor, measured humor, to bring down his opponents. The kind of language that you would probably hear from what we call populist politicians, but being used to bring down potential dictators. Now, in his own theories on rhetoric, Cicero wrote extensively in the Invenzione, for example, about when he got to that third aspect of rhetoric, the elocutio that we were just hearing about. He spoke about the importance of clarity in language use, incorrectness, but something that was above those two was his third point, appropriateness. You have to deliver an appropriate lecture. It has to be worded in an appropriate way, otherwise it's not going to work. And only then can you think about bringing in the ornament, the style figures, which would be schemes which deviated at a syntactic level, repetition and the like, and tropes that deviate at a semantic level, things like metaphors and metonymies and very image-bearing rhetorical devices. He also talked of the different styles you can use in different areas. A plain style completely devoid of style figures, a middle style that had a few, and a grand or florid style. So he was really telling his students and his speechwriters to say, look, you've got to consider the situation and then choose wisely for the moment. That appropriateness is absolute. This goes on. It's not just something from antiquity. If any of you have read anything by Hugh Blair, a Scottish minister and professor of rhetoric at the University of Edinburgh in the 18th century, pushing back a little bit on some of that Enlightenment thinking, spoke as well and wrote extensively about the notion of clarity and purity and appropriateness. And a lot of his ideas actually ended up in the United States at the end of the Revolution, once the Brits had been kicked out. And universities started to teach courses like rhetoric and composition in the 1810s and 1820s already, something that we'd almost given up on in Europe. So this idea of thinking about your language choices is something and addressing using a more popular register in certain situations is something that's been around for a long time. I mean, I've had my students look at the speeches of Abraham Lincoln and Franklin D. Roosevelt and some of the speeches of Martin Luther King, and all three of these would not shy away from using language that appealed to the people that they were addressing. You know, Lincoln spoke to the common people about things like unity and equality in an appropriate register. Roosevelt was trying to reassure the working class people on his New Deal. And of course, Martin Luther King Jr., in addition to lots of biblical quotes that he used, he also had a lot of very down-to-earth, simple language that addressed the poor, the disenfranchised in society. So all of these people could use simple, plain language, which we sometimes see as populist. These days we see it being used primarily by the right and by the left. The centre tends not to do it. I've spoken to a number of speechwriters and politicians in the past few years, and one thing that keeps coming back time and time again is dumbing down. We're not going to dumb down. We've got to stick to our principles and our levels. I want to introduce you to some ideas and some theories in a second. I can skip that particular slide. Have anybody heard of Herb Simons? He's a communications expert from America. He passed away recently. He had a wonderful model called coactive persuasion. Now, I'm not going to read this aloud. I've got some points on the next slide, actually, which are perhaps more important. Basically, he said there's a topic-oriented approach, which assumes that all receivers are alike. This is me. I'm delivering this message in this way, and that's it. And he says, you know, you can do it that way if you like, but then you're probably not going to persuade anybody to either think differently or to act differently. And what you need to have is a receiver-oriented approach. If you just look at this first one at the top here, it assumes that all receivers are unique, or at least that some differences make a difference. The second point, receiver-oriented approaches learns from receivers, if possible, what they need, what they want, what they know, what they value. If you speak to any psychologist, certainly a social psychologist, they'll tell you that people are made up of two things, beliefs and values. And those things lead to attitudes, and that eventually leads to behaviors. Okay? Now, if you're not tapping into those beliefs and those attitudes, you're not going to have them motivated to think or act in a certain way. So it's a really interesting model, this, which I encourage you to go and have a look at. I just want to dive a little deeper into it. In addition to saying that it's receiver-orientated and situation-sensitive, which is what that previous slide shows us, he says that speakers can do things like combining images of similarity between the speaker and the audience, while at the same time promoting a kind of expertise and a uniqueness and a trustworthiness. He also says that if you can find a premise, usually these are general level premises that people can agree to, you can then move back downwards towards your actual argument. He says, you know, if you appear to be reasonable, if you offer psychological support, you're drawing on your ethos here as a speaker, then that can also bring you closer to the people you're trying to persuade. And you should also make full use of your entire communication network, including your body, your stance, your facial expressions, gestures, etc., etc. If we look more closely at this second bullet point about similarity and uniqueness, this is quite interesting. This combining this similarity and credibility. I'll just read this aloud. Emphasizing similarities in background, experience, and group affiliation, or displaying evidences of commonality through dialect or dress or mannerisms, that can help move you closer to your audience psychologically. It's a non-conscious thing. It's happening through what they call peripheral processing instead of central processing. But most of the stuff we do anyhow is by this peripheral route, by using these cognitive shortcuts. And people usually want to take advice from somebody who is credible. If we look at the similarity, Simons and others have talked about this notion of plain folks devices, the persuaders using the language to suggest that the persuadee, that they share a lot of commonalities. You have to go to be very careful with this, though. It can go horribly wrong. If your character, your ethos is known for one thing, and all of a sudden you try something else, that can backfire, especially if you repeat it unnecessarily. An example could be, my father was a toolmaker, my mother was a nurse. Which could work once or twice, but when hammered home, that loses its... so the person is also important, not just what you say, but who's saying it. This notion of this super representative is quite interesting. So the ideal communicator is someone who appears to be similar enough, but also different enough in an expertise and trustworthiness kind of thing. If those two things can come together, that's where you have a very powerful persuader. You probably all know Frank Luntz's work. This is a great little book. It's from 2007, I think. I put 8, but I think it's 7. He is a famous commentator, pollster, even speechwriter for the Republican Party in the United States of America. He's written this book. It's got a number of things in there very interesting. I'm just going to touch on the 10 rules of successful communication. What this book shows you is how important words are. He has a nice sentence here at the bottom, which I think about a lot. I'm not quite sure what it means, but it keeps me thinking. He says, "It's not what you say, it is what people hear." Now that's people bringing to bear their values and their beliefs that are meeting your discourse halfway, and they're making meaning, or how they see it, of what you've said. Here's a quote. I'm going to ask you who you think said this. "Don't tell me words don't matter. I have a dream, just words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, just words. We have nothing to fear but fear itself, just words. These are just speeches." Who said that? No. Who? No. It could have been. Anybody else? AI? No. It's from 2008. Barack Obama. Barack Obama, 2008. So when he'd just become president, his first term. So, of course, he knew the value of words and what they mean for culture and history and everything. Back to Luntz. These are his 10 rules for successful communication. Now, his first 2 are basically what I've been talking about. Simplicity, use small words. Brevity, use short sentences. Of course, this will be language specific. English is a language that can use short sentences. If you have your language is a more complex grammatical form with case forms, you may find that it's quite regular and normal to have a paragraph that's just a sentence. So this is specifically geared towards the English language. Number 6 is also relevant. Sound and texture matter. Like I say, have a look at this book. It's still very valuable and quite revealing, especially if you see how successful President Trump was in communicating. I remember when he started, I was fascinated and disturbed, really, because with my students, I teach, as Lucy said, I teach a lot of rhetoric. I mean, Obama was a goldmine. You know, he knew about rhetoric. As a law professor, he'd studied rhetoric. He had these speechwriters who were fantastic rhetoricians, and they sat down and they crafted their speeches using classical models. And then along comes Trump, and he says that he does exactly the opposite. He does things that are not supposed to work. That's not supposed to work. No, you've broken that rule, and that shouldn't work. You shouldn't do that. But it did work, and that fascinated me, you know. And I had to have a complete reset in what works in certain situations, what doesn't. So here's Luntz writing about this in 2007. And, you know, 10 years later, the Republican government of President Trump are using this playbook: simplicity, brevity, sound and texture matter. Here are some other quotes. You've probably read quite a bit by Peggy Noonan. If not, I would advise that. She's a great model. Also wrote for the Republican Party for Ronald Reagan, primarily. Peggy Noonan says, there is often an unadorned quality to sections of great speeches, a directness and a simplicity of expression. We seem to forget that sometimes. And here's a quote from a rhetoric professor, a colleague I know, who spoke at this conference before, Jens Kjeldsen. I don't know if some of you know Jens. With his colleagues writing in his book, Speech Writing Theory and Practice. They say the following: ostensibly, language must be fitting for the occasion. The speechwriter will have to adapt the style, for instance, specialized words or technical terms, to the likely level of the audience. Wise words there, not always easy. I mean, knowing your audience is not always easy. This second point here, know your audience, Cicero theorized that, well, before him, Aristotle had said there are two types of audience. There's the old and the young, there's the rich and the poor, there's the powerful and the powerless, and you had to adjust your speech to those two opposites. It wasn't great, but it was okay. Cicero comes along and he says there are 5 types of audience, and you've got to address this in your introduction, in your exordium. There could be, for example, a group that likes you and likes what you're saying, and you don't have to even bother with an introduction there. There's a group who dislike you and dislike what you're going to say, and you have to use a different strategy for that. Something called an insinuation, insinuatio, where you have a nice little checklist that you can go through, where you ingratiate yourself to your audience. But the main group are these 3 in the middle. And what the person has to do, the speaker, is generate goodwill by showing him or herself to be open and reasonable and accepting, etc., etc. And these groups, he had them pigeonholed as the people who don't care about the topic. So how do I activate them? What words do I use? The people who are unintelligent. How do I now communicate with those people? And the people who are just not bothered, a bit bored or a bit tired, what do I do for those? So it seems quite basic, but even he was thinking about 5 different types of audience. And if you look at advertising, history of advertising, I mean, we didn't realize that there were different groups out there until, the 1950s. Before then, it was just a case of, white man in coat, buy this, it works. And that was it. And then in the 50s, you've probably seen the Mad Men, that episode, that series from a long time ago, where they said, there are people out there. And, and there may be different kinds of people. I mean, today it's incredibly focused on you through social media. It's not just you, it's you at different times of the day doing different things, messages being sent to you. So it's really what they call narrowcasted. It's really narrow today. But it's good for us to think about this. Another nice exercise that speechwriters could do. Anybody heard of Protagoras? He was one of those sophists that we just heard about. Sophists that believed that truth was relative, depending on your cultural background and where you were from. He said he had students doing the dissologoi, countervailing arguments. So you'd have an issue, and people would be either in favour or against it, but he got them to argue on both sides of that issue. It's something they did in the law schools for years in the Roman Republic and beyond. It's a really good exercise because you're not trying to convert yourself, you're trying to prepare for the arguments that are going to come up. So you're preparing ahead for the arguments you can anticipate in a debate, and you can prepare your answers for them as well. But it's also a good exercise in taking on the language of the other as well. Not the other, but the person on the other side of the issue. It can be any issue. It's a nice little exercise. And speaking of exercise, I want to share one with you that I did for years. It was in a creative writing class. And the students had all done classical rhetoric beforehand, so they knew about all the models. And then they wanted to be... The course was split in two. I did the first half, and then we had a real writer come in and do the second half, a successful published writer. But what I was doing, I called it playing around with language. I wanted to call it talk like Trump, but I thought that was too provocative. And what they were doing, they were writing and they were speaking. And they were writing and they were reading aloud and they were speaking to each other. And I just basically copied what they were doing in classical times. This is not something I've made up. They have something called the progymnasmata. So we started with a very famous speech, the Encomium to Helen by Gorgias. He was another one of those sophists, the first speech writers. And this speech, even in English, of course it's been translated out of ancient Greek, even in English it's full of style figures. It's too heavy. It's unreadable. You know, one sentence might have 6 competing style figures. Of course, he was trying to sell his wares, so he was showing, it was advertising, so he was showing what he could do, you know, and that's why it's... So I get the students, first of all, to strip that bare, take out all those style figures and read it aloud. What do we have left? Well, very little, you know, but we still have a text there. Remember the plain style and the florid style that Cicero spoke about? And we do that. I get them to write a very florid text. I say, use 15 style figures, any ones you want. I train them in about, I don't know, 30 or 40. You choose what you, and put them in, and tell me where they are. And then strip them out, and read those 2 texts aloud, and sit down and let one of the other students in the classroom read them aloud to you. They sound completely and utterly different. And we do it grammatically as well. We write a text that's full of adverbs and adjectives. And these can be, you know, polysyllabic or monosyllabic. We can throw in concrete nouns and abstract nouns. We play around with language. And we have these 2 versions, the florid and the bare. And like I said, through writing themselves and by speaking them to each other, it really, really hits home what you can do with language and why words matter and how they matter. And we even have a little focus group as well that we can go into and try something on them as well. So maybe it's something you can try among yourselves, if you're in a team of speechwriters, something like that. My students found it very rewarding, and I thought it was a really productive exercise. Okay, I'm going to draw to a close now. We started, well actually Lucy said something. She said, we're in a time of change for speechwriters. And I think we are. And I think this is a change we need to consider. Using what's known as populist language strategically, with ethics in mind as well. So you need to know a little bit about your ethics, you know. Are you a universalist? Are you a utilitarianist? Are you a situationalist? What are you doing and why are you doing it and for what effect? But it's not dumbing down. It really isn't. It's like a form of highly appropriate and potentially highly effective form of human linguistic communication. You need to think about that. As I say to people sometimes, and I mentioned it earlier on, you can choose to communicate the way you want to communicate, irrespective of who's in front of you. That's fine. That's fine. You're unlikely to persuade anybody. if you take into consideration who's in front of you, what you want to persuade them of, and you use language that's appropriate for that moment and for that audience, then the message will come across. Okay, the person may say, I disagree, I don't accept it. But they could also say, I agree. If you don't get them to that stage, the answer is always no. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that and take some questions if we have time.